All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here at the end of the last session. I'm Megan. I'm a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin, and today I'm presenting a project that I'm calling Feminist Icon Design. And for any of you that don't know my work or haven't really seen me at the last few NACISs, my project is really built around feminist cartography. So what is this? How can we think about cartography or maps in general through a feminist lens? And so I'm really trying to engage feminist theory, feminism, with actual map practice. And so in an attempt to be a good academic as well as a good cartographer, I'm really trying to think of this as not only just theory, because we can sometimes go too far theory, but how do we actually apply these things? So when we think about feminist mapping, what is it like in theory and in practice? And today I'm going to be mostly talking about the practical aspect of this, but I also want to briefly touch on the theoretical side as well. And so if we take a quick snapshot of feminist cartography over time, it's not a new thing. So this isn't something I came up with myself. I really truly draw on a bunch of different transdisciplinary fields to pull this into cartography and map design. And so we can think back to our history of cartography classes and think of the critical turn in geography and cartography. But we can also be looking at these newer fields right now where there's a lot of momentum in feminist design. Maybe not feminist map design exactly, but feminist design. And so we can think of feminist digital geographies, data justice, data feminism, and feminist data visualization as these areas that are really robust right now. And there's a lot of momentum to push feminist map making itself also forward. And so throughout this talk, I'm going to be drawing on Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein's work on data feminism. I'm kind of using some of their literature, their articles as a guide or framework for some of the workshops that I've been running. And so you'll see their names pop up a few times. And I also want to say the first part of my project is really trying to pin down what are feminist cartographies. And so this is truly a work in progress. This is an example from the CART lab that I work at the UW Madison. But we're really trying to grapple with, it's problematic to define this in a really rigid way. But if we want a starting point or we want an accessible entry point to bring people into this conversation, I'm trying to figure out a way to introduce feminist cartography to a broader audience. And so the way I'm currently defining feminist cartographies, which is built off of Catherine and Lauren's work, is as the often visual expression of spatial information that intentionally and explicitly addresses questions of power, inequality, representation, and ethics. And so there will never be a perfect, feminist map through and through. It's not possible. But I like to think that we can use these feminist principles to think about data and content, data collection and also data storage. How do we have these data sets to begin with? But also the form itself. So we can think about the representations. We can think about them as subjective expressions of design. But we can also think and utilize these principles in the actual mapping process. And so I'm interested in thinking about feminist principles across content or data content or content form and process, excuse me. And so what's great about the D'Ignazio and Klein paper is that they provide kind of like a roadmap of these are the principles we can start to think about and we can start including in some of our visualizations. And so we can think about binaries, kind of this yes, no in our data. We can also think about pluralistic or multiplicities and complexities that happen in our data and in our maps and in our process. We can think about power, we can think about empowerment, we can think about context, subjectivity, uncertainty, embodiment and emotion and affect. How do we bring those into the map? As well as the recognition of labor invisibilities and invisibilities in our mapping. And so I use this framework throughout the workshops that I've been running and that I'll be expanding upon. And so to show a few examples before I show you some of the work that the workshops I've been doing, here are some examples of feminist cartography in practice now. Anita Lucchesi is a PhD student at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, and she's really collated this incredible data set on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so this database goes back to 1900 and is essentially the lost or missing data. There's no one place where this data set has existed until Anita pulled this all together. And so when we think about feminist principles in data, we can think about what is the missing data, who are at the margins of our data set, and who's being erased in some of that. So I think Anita's work is really incredible in terms of thinking about data through a feminist lens. I also do feminist cartography, go figure. But I've been really interested in the actual map form. And so some of my previous work, this is a map from the map gallery a few years ago, really was exploring the symbolization of border lines. And so generally we pull up some natural earth data or something like that for our administrative boundaries. Maybe they're just solid black lines, or we add some, a dashed line to show some contentious borders. But what I was trying to pull out, and actually some of you may have drawn some of these little sketches, but I wanted to ask people to redesign symbols based on what's actually happening on those borders in those particular places. And so through this idea of using feminist principles of like subjectivity and context, how can we think about and redesign border lines themselves? And then we can also think and be deliberate about incorporating feminist principles into actual process. And so in our intro to cartography classes, generally there's a workflow, generally there's some sort of guideline of how we encourage students to work through a map. But what happens when we ask students or NACIS participants or other folks to really incorporate feminist principles into the design process? And so this is an example that we did at UW Madison. It was an all-day mapping workshop where we looked at local recidivism or return to prison rates in Madison locally, but we also asked students to think about them specifically through a feminist lens. And so all of these things from data, content, and process are all really possible, and people are doing this type of work. And it's not to say that, so I chose those examples because I would, Anita and myself and the folks that organized the design challenge, we would consider ourselves feminist cartographers. But I also want to recognize that even just based on the presentations today, people are thinking in these ways, but we're not necessarily putting a label on it. And so what I argue in general is that if we push these things like the North as a construct, what's the next construct we can dismantle? And so how can we keep pushing mapping in new ways through a feminist lens? And maybe we're all feminist cartographers, and hopefully eventually will be. But how can we use this lens to really push our designs? And so people ask me why icons. And so at Madison, I teach some of our classes from time to time, and I was really trying to figure out the best way to introduce feminist cartography to students. And so this is the Maki icon set from Mapbox. And initially I was like, okay, points. These have no dimension. They're supposed to be the most simple thing for us to map. Of course, icons have a lot of detail in them themselves, but I immediately was like, perfect. If I have to narrow it down, this is the easiest way to do it. Icons are more complex than just a simple lat long. But the other thing we can think about is in some sort of base map, this is just a tile set from Mapbox, icons generally go pretty low on our visual hierarchy. It's not until we call them out and actually can zoom in or see their detail do we really come to recognize them and they become more apparent to us. And so these everyday objects these low-lying features on our map tend to get kind of forgotten, or maybe we're not necessarily thinking about how, maybe we're more concerned about the base map design than the icons themselves. And so there are these low-lying features that happen routinely, and so there's an opportunity there for us to focus on those things that reoccur really frequently. I also love icons because they're extremely flexible. We can abstract them completely and use circles or stars or things like that. We can add more detail when we can, but we can also use associative icons that really draw out, okay, this isn't the picnic table, or this isn't the restaurant, but it's a fork with spaghetti on it. So it makes us think of a restaurant itself. And so I love the malleability of icons because we can use them in so many different ways. I also love icons because they can be subversive. And so Neil Horsky recently had a show in Madison where it was selections from a symbology of struggle, where he took an existing icon set and relabeled them. And so this is a 1970s, thank you, a 1970s icon set from Henry Dreyfuss, and you can see that he's relabeled them in terms of like climate change in the bottom left on the middle, mass incarceration, thinking about no harassment with these icons. And so there's an opportunity here to really think about icons in this like subversive, like non-traditional, unconventional way. And so I've been really excited about them. The other thing about icons is they're supposed to be universal. They're supposed to save us time, right? If we're spending all this time in building a beautiful interactive map, we might not have time to design or customize our own icon set all the time. And so we're supposed to be able to pick them up and use them across contexts. They're also generally simplifications or abstractions of our world too. And so these are what they're supposed to be doing, and I'm trying to kind of maybe force us to think about that in a little bit of a different lens. And so the other question I get is why Maki? it could have been any icon set. It could have been national parks. It could have been Carto. It could have been MapZen. Our students use Mapbox Studio for one of their projects, so it was just a nice segue. But I'm really using this as an idea of like, how can we rethink all icon sets, not just Maki and things like that. And so, so in the effort to think about feminist map-making practice, I've been running feminist map-making workshops. And so the first one I did is kind of the rule that if your advisor is gone, you can do whatever the heck you want in his class. And so in our Intro to Cartography classes, and Rob's over there, but I started doing these little like workshops with students in an hour and 15 minutes. And so in Intro to Cartography, and then I also did this in our Intro to GIS class. I also did the similar workshop at Maptime Amsterdam this summer. I was really trying to tease out, okay, if I only have 2 hours, what can I get these participants to do? And so in these workshops, I asked these participants to think about these feminist data visualization principles and to rethink and redesign icons. And so the first step, they literally just had to pick an icon, and I wanted them to at least be kind of reflective about those icons to begin with and think about the limitations. What isn't that icon doing? What is it doing well? What is it not? Maybe what are the challenges that it's facing? But how can we improve that too through a feminist lens? And then I asked them to specifically look at some of those data visualization principles and start redesigning that icon in as many ways as possible to show the range of contexts or like new context that we can bring these icons to. I asked them to keep everything because I'm usually more concerned about the process than the actual final product. But I had them hold on to those records. And so just to recap, these are some of the principles they were trying to incorporate into their design. And then finally, I asked them to just annotate their sketches. And so I wanted them to actually like tell me what they were trying to do with them. And so I actually could then, kind of pick their brains a little bit and ask the right questions to see how they derived a certain product. This is just an example from the Maptime Amsterdam. And then these are just some sketches that people they left behind and let me use for this presentation. And so everything was in analog, and people were just using pen and paper, whatever was in the room. And so it was an easy entry point. There was no computers, there was no GIS, there was no Illustrator or Map Publisher, but everyone could just rethink these icons really quickly. And so basically what I did is I pulled up icons that people chose to redesign. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you the icon that they redesigned, and then I'll show you their attempts to redesign them. And this was amazing in the Netherlands. Immediately and very emphatically, we were told that that is not a Dutch bike. A Dutch bike is upright, it's flat, and so this is a cruiser, and anybody from the age of 3 to 97 can ride these bikes. They were convinced that the rideshare was the actual icon was a motorcycle. And so this is really the point that context matters when we think about our icons, that in general, I would say the bike share icon is probably not universal, especially for the Netherlands, because there are multiple revisions of this icon throughout all of the sketches. And so we can think about context and subjectivity through the bike share icon. I also was surprised that someone maybe was trying to rethink the dentist icon. I was like, this seems not super problematic in my mind. But what I loved about this person apparently loves going to the dentist. And so there's actually like a smile happening. And maybe it's because I think that this icon also has braces and eventually, there's gonna be this beautiful smile. But I feel like this has such a different feel than just kind of the sterile tooth itself. If this was a grimacing face, maybe there was a tooth extraction or something like that, that would have a total different look and feel to it. But it would really kind of embrace this idea that icons can be emotive too. They can represent how we're experiencing particular places and particular situations. So we can see those together. This one was interesting, and so the next series is going to think about binaries, and the student that was looking at the clothing icon was really just kind of saying, okay, well this clearly looks to be like a cis male shirt, and so what she wanted to do was to take the icon and remove any sort of gender identity or gender orientation that is placed onto the shirt, and by using the hanger instead. And so I thought this was a really interesting way to think about binaries in a new way, and maybe the hanger actually works perfectly. And so if we want to remove any sort of gender bias built into icons, the hanger itself disrupts that. And so similarly, we can think about the bathroom icon, which of course is, I feel like is in the last few years has been brought to attention, and there are different types of icons that people are using now. But this was a really interesting question for the students as well as the Maptime participants to think through. Okay, what are the other options beyond the binary, stereotypical heteronormative man-woman differentiation? And so some people chose something like the toilet or toilet paper or the toilet themselves. This was an interesting sketch that you can actually see the participant kind of working through different ideas. And so what's the issue with the male-female icon? And then if you add WC, there's a language barrier there. If then you go to the actual toilet, that's also a cultural construct. Or if you just do a square with a hole in the middle of it, maybe it needs description, maybe it doesn't. It depends on the cultural construct as well. There are other options that might be inappropriate or seem to be rude for the last two. But then there was also like everyone has had to go to the bathroom, and so maybe something like this would work, right? And so how can we rethink design or the bathroom icon through this lens? And I think it was really interesting to see what people came up with, but also to see how they work through that and how, okay, when you go from one option to the other, what works and what doesn't. The other icon that I thought was interesting within the icon sets, the police officer is the most detailed body form in the icon set. And so when we think about this, especially in our current political climate, there's a lot of authoritative power that's associated with that. And so there were students that wanted to examine the power relationships that are happening within the police icon, and so by resorting to maybe some sort of shield or maybe abstracting it completely into kind of more the marker symbol. But we also had someone that really wanted to kind of dismantle this idea of authority and think about and deconstruct the power dynamics happen here. And the further in the conversations after they drew this, these are essentially like gun deaths from police officers. And so we can think about how icons themselves can also deconstruct the way power plays out in our realities. We had students just pick up abstract icons, which I was super into, but I was kind of surprised. But they really wanted to think about uncertainty. So maybe we don't necessarily need these hard lines on some of our abstract icons. There was another group that really was interested in the circle icon and the malleability of using abstract icons. And so in this, they got full credit. This was great. They started just labeling it with different things. So this could be swimming, this could be toilet, this could be me. It could be anything, and so there's some beauty in using these abstract icons when we can put a specific label onto it. And so in some ways, the abstract icons embrace this idea of like, let's think about complexity and just really nail that this is me, this is Meghan Kelly. It doesn't have to be a very gendered icon or something like that. That it can be more complex with that through just having this abstraction. The other thing that I found interesting throughout this process is we're really good at, we should all be very good about metadata and keeping track of our process and being transparent about those things. So I think across cartography, that's becoming more and more current. But it was also great that students, some put their names on it and some did not put their names on it. And so I think there's kind of this idea of making your own labor visible, recognizing labor that goes into these projects is super crucial. And whether or not you put your name on it, there's a level of transparency that's available when you do name something. I also think that keeping track of process and annotation and context around whatever you make is really important. And so this is just like a quick rundown of the students' interpretations of their icons. Last, I think of icon design as an opportunity for empowerment. And so the students thought, and the participants at Maptime thought this was a really great opportunity to explore icons in new ways. It's based on exploration and not on a deadline. And so there was this other opportunity to really encourage people to find icons that fit their situations, their contexts, their projects. And so with that, I think the big takeaway here is I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect icon set. Maybe this is it, I don't know. But I think there are opportunities to think about the icon tools that are out there, and something like the Noun project, which is open source and anyone can contribute to it. But what if we had the Noun project where people provide context, they provide examples of when they've used these things, when it worked, when it didn't, and so maybe we could build some sort of collective icon set with this. And last, I think if Maptime participants and students can do this in 2 hours, imagine what, like, if we all actually were taking these principles into account in our everyday mapping or map work, what opportunities would that lend us to? This session, I think, was really great to see, like, the north arrow being, the north arrow in scale and local context being questioned. But what if we just keep nudging that forward, and how does the map change, and how does it change for the better? And so with that, thank you.